From Vermont.
Do I ask for the quorum call to be vitiated?
Without objection.
All right. Mr. President, later today or tomorrow, as part of the American Rescue Plan, which we will be discussing in the next few days, which I happen to believe is the most significant piece of legislation to come to the floor of the Senate in decades in terms of addressing the crises facing working families. As part of that piece of legislation, I will be offering an amendment to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, which I believe is a starvation wage, to $15 an hour over a 5-year period, 5 years. And I think there's been some miscommunication around here, and there are people who are saying it's going from $7.25 to $15 an hour in 1 year. Not true. It goes from $7.25 to $9.50 to $11 to $12.50 to $14 to $15 an hour. So anyone who says we're raising the minimum wage in 1 year in the midst of a pandemic to $15 an hour is simply not telling the truth. Mr. President, this amendment is similar to a bill which I have brought forth, the Raise the Wage Act, which I am proud to say has been co-sponsored by some 38 members of the Senate, and this is also similar to legislation which has already passed the U.S. House of Representatives, and I thank them and I thank my friends in the Progressive Caucus in the House for doing a great job in pushing this legislation. I should also add for my Senate colleagues that this legislation raising the minimum wage is supported by some 300 national organizations, including the 12 million members of the AFL-CIO and virtually every major union in this country. This is something that unions like the SEIU, one of the largest unions in this country, have been fighting for a very long time. And I should also add here that while raising the minimum wage is going to impact every low-wage worker in this country, because African American and Latino workers often are earning poverty wages, it significantly impacts the lives of the minority communities as well. And that is why, among so many other organizations supporting this amendment, it is supported by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. It is supported by the National Organization for Women, because again, when we talk about low-wage workers, we're talking about the minority community. We're talking about women. And that is why it's supported by groups like UNIDOS, the American Association of University Women, Indivisible, Justice for Migrant Women, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the National Women's Law Center. So once again, this is legislation that will increase wages for 30 million American workers. And if you ask me what the great economic crisis in our country is today, it's not just high unemployment, it's not just income and wealth inequality. It is that half of our people today and before the pandemic were living paycheck to paycheck. Their wages were so low that if they had a problem with their car or their kid got sick, suddenly they were in financial crisis. And in the richest country in the history of the world, half of our people should not be facing economic desperation when their car breaks down. And the reason for that is significantly that many millions of workers are earning starvation wages, and I underline that, starvation wages in this country. I'd love to hear anybody get up here and tell me that they could live on $7.25 an hour. They could live on $8 an hour. They could live on $9 an hour. You can't. And I've been all over this country, and I have talked to workers who are making 10, 11 bucks an hour with tears streaming down their cheeks, telling me what it's like to work for starvation wages and try to raise your kids. So the time is long overdue. Last time this Congress passed an increase in the minimum wage was in the year 2007. 2007. It is time to raise the minimum wage. It is time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage of 15 bucks an hour. Now, later on today, or this evening, as part of my support for this enormously important piece of legislation as chairman of the Budget Committee, I will be speaking more about why we need to raise the minimum wage. But I want to focus on one part of the minimum wage bill that I have been hearing a little bit about in the last couple of days from some of my colleagues, and that is the provision to raise the tip wage, now the tip wage, so everybody understands it, is the minimum, federal minimum wage that applies to waiters and waitresses, barbers, hairstylists, parking attendants, and others. Fellow Americans, do you know what that federal minimum wage today is for that person who waits on your table at a restaurant? It is $2.12 an hour. Yeah, you heard me correctly. $2.12 an hour. And the proposal is as part of the minimum wage bill, amendment that I will be offering, that tip minimum wage will go up from $2.12 an hour to $14.95 an hour over a 7-year period, longer than the overall national minimum wage would go up. And this is something that clearly is desperately needed. Now, I know that here in Washington, at any time we bring forth serious and important legislation for working people, the big money interests get to work. And all of their lobbyists who make their 6 figures or 7 figures a year, they get to work on Congress and tell you why you can't do anything to protect the most vulnerable and hard-hit people in this country. So the National Restaurant Association, they are a very powerful lobbying organization. I guess they have been enormously successful because we've not raised the federal minimum wage since 2007. So this powerful lobbying organization is going around and they're telling members of the House and the Senate that raising the tipped wage is opposed by restaurant workers and it would be harmful to the interest of waiters and waitresses and other people. That is not true. That is what lobbyists say representing big money interests. That's what they are paid to say. But that is not what workers who wait on tables are telling us. One Fair Wage, an organization, a grassroots organization representing service employees, waiters, waitresses, and others, has just delivered to the White House a petition with 140,000 signatures on it from service workers who are demanding that they receive the same minimum wage as every other worker in this country. And polling among service employees and non-service employees also supports the reality that Americans want our waiters and our waitresses and other service employees to get a fair and equal minimum wage similar to what other low-wage workers are receiving. Now, I have heard from some who tell me that, people are waiting on tables, and by the way, I was one of the worst waiters in the history of the country, but I was a waiter a long time ago. I know a little bit about it. And I am hearing from some that waiters and waitresses, they're doing really well, making a whole lot of money, and they don't need an increase in the minimum wage. And let's be clear. When you talk about the restaurant and the hotel industry, you're talking about mass discrepancies in the kind of incomes that people receive. I will not deny for a second. My daughter worked in a fancy restaurant. She did quite well. So if you're working in a hotel, in a fancy restaurant where you have a menu that is quite expensive, you get a $100 meal, and you're 20% of it, that's $20, you're waiting on 3 or 4 tables, you're doing okay. I don't deny that for a second. And I wish those waiters and waitresses who work so hard a continued success. But let us be clear, not everybody works in a fancy restaurant or a big hotel which has a high-priced menu. You got a whole lot of people working in diners, working in working-class restaurants where the menu is not that fancy. And maybe it is $10 for lunch or $8 for lunch, and 20% of that is $1.60 on an $8 meal. And let us be very clear that when we talk about waiters and waitresses, some 70% of tip workers in this country are women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. In other words, women who are waitressing have a 3 times higher poverty rate than the rest of the U.S. workforces. Their tips are not keeping up with their needs. These women waitresses, use food stamps at double the rate of other workers in this country. And importantly, and increasingly so, amazingly, during this pandemic, waitresses suffer from the highest rates of sexual harassment of workers in any industry because they are forced to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families through the tips that they get. And we're hearing stories where people in a restaurant, guys in a restaurant, say, well, take your mask off. You want a tip? Let me see how you look. And clearly this is unacceptable behavior. I also want to point out that the idea of moving tip wages to the same level over a period, in this case 7 years, moving it to the same level as the overall minimum wage is not a radical idea. Ain't a Bernie Sanders idea. It already exists. I don't know if people know this. It already exists in 7 states. So in 7 states right now, people who work in the service industry, waiters, waitresses, and others, are getting the same minimum wage as all the workers in those states. And those states are California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Montana, Alaska, and Minnesota. 7 states already pay their service industry workers the same wages as they pay other minimum wage workers. And I should point out that all of these states experienced a growth in the number of small businesses and restaurants after they abolished the tip minimum wage. So they abolished the tip minimum wage. It did not drive restaurants out of business. In fact, in those states where the tip minimum wage equaled the general minimum wage, we saw a growth in the number of restaurants. And furthermore, to respond to another piece of misinformation, waiters and waitresses in these states received more in tips, not less. So the mythology that's going around here is that if we raise the minimum wage for waiters and waitresses, when somebody walks into a restaurant, they're going to be thinking, oh my goodness, this person is now making 10, 12 bucks an hour, I'm going to leave less of a tip. Ain't the way the world works. Let me also say a word about how the pandemic, which has impacted workers in every sector, but how it has impacted tipped workers. In many states where the tip minimum wage still exists, tip workers, and this is rather unbelievable, tip workers did not even qualify for unemployment. So we're talking now in this bill of substantially increasing unemployment, a $400 supplement, and we're talking about extending it to late August. But tip workers whose minimum wage is so low, they do not even qualify for unemployment. In an industry where more than 6 million workers have lost their jobs, and obviously we all know the restaurant and hotel industry has been terribly hard hit by the pandemic, more than 60% of sub-minimum wage earners could not get unemployment benefits because the state and federal government denied them benefits for not making enough earned income. You all got that? So we're talking about the need, and I certainly agree with that, to expand and extend unemployment benefits, but you got a whole lot of workers who are earning starvation wages who are not going to be eligible for unemployment. At the same time, as restaurants reopen, the CDC has declared restaurants as the most dangerous place to work. We all know that. It's obvious. You're coming face to face with your customers. And now servers in the midst of that are responsible. You're a waiter, you're a waitress. You are now responsible for telling somebody who walks into your restaurant that they must socially distance themselves or wear a mask, not necessarily a comfortable position for a worker dealing with a hostile customer. I would also add, as all of us are increasingly aware of sexual harassment in general in this country, that the restaurant industry has some of the highest rates of sexual harassment. In a workplace where 70% of the workers are women and where they rely on their customers to determine their wages because of tips, women are often expected to withstand sexual harassment in order to get those tips. In states where the sub-minimum wage has been eliminated, sexual harassment has been cut substantially because women no longer have to take that. It's not an all-or-nothing proposition. So I'm going to be, if you ask me again, what the major economic crisis facing this country, we know unemployment is sky high. We know income inequality is unacceptable. And so many other factors are out there about the economy. But at the top of my list is the fact that tens of millions of workers in the richest country on earth are barely making it. They're having a hard time feeding their kids. They're having a hard time paying their rent. Many of them get inadequate or no health insurance at all. Now, year after year, the American people, I think, correctly perceive that this Congress bows to the wishes of the rich and the powerful, give tax breaks to people who don't need it, we deregulate companies that should be regulated, et cetera, et cetera. In this moment of economic and health crisis, now is the time for us to stand with working families. And the most important thing that we can do is to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. This is what Joe Biden believes. This is what the Democratic platform stands for. And this is what at least 38 co-sponsors of Raise the Wage Act also believe. So here we are in a pivotal moment. The working class is being decimated. People are struggling to feed their kids. We've got to raise wages in this country, and we have got to raise the wages of tip workers. I'll be back later for more on this, but thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
I would ask unanimous consent to add a letter about tip wages signed by hundreds of organizations to my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered.